Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for being here, both in the room in Toronto and everyone who's joining us online. We're so thrilled you could spend your precious lunch hour to join us in this conversation. On behalf of ERA Architects, welcome to this interdisciplinary panel on the topic of heritage and cultural health. I'm Alessandro Tersigni. I'm a cultural journalist and a writer at ERA Architects, and I'll be moderating the discussion today. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're meeting on the traditional territory of many First Nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. Land acknowledgements have become part of our meeting conventions in Canada, and I think this speaks to today's discussion about the relationships between remembrance, recognition, and healing. This event is part of ERA's regular weekly forum series, but this is the first session that's been public, so we're very excited about that. For those of you who don't know, ERA is an architecture and planning firm that works in a diversity of ways to activate the built environment through heritage conservation, landscape architecture, urban design, and cultural stewardship. We think of heritage as forward-looking, which is exactly what today is about. We're grateful to have a fabulous set of speakers here today. We really couldn't ask for a better panel. And we're going to discuss our relationships with spaces, those we design and conserve, and perhaps those we neglect and overlook, and how those relationships shape our cultural health. So what is cultural health? Health can mean many things to many people, obviously. Health can mean, of course, medical equilibrium, but health can also mean intergenerational awareness. Health can mean feeling grounded. Health can mean telling stories that are valuable. It can mean conserving places we love or places that we didn't know were lovable, adapting them for new uses, and perhaps most crucially, making them accessible to the greatest diversity of people. In a city like Toronto, which is currently being intensely designed and redesigned and envisioned and evaluated, and above all, occupied, the question of cultural health is really a question about what we should do with the spaces that we have and why. These questions come at a time when we're collectively re-examining many of the ways that we've shaped urban places in the past. The rerouting and renaturalization of the Don River, the retrofitting of towers and the subdividing of houses in Toronto's vast suburbs, and the removal and recontextualization of colonial statues are just a few examples of that. So to look more closely at all of this, it's a pleasure to introduce our panel. Please join me in welcoming them. Melanie Marsden is an accessibility and inclusion practitioner and a traditional counselor at Anishinaabe Health Toronto. Melanie recently completed a Master's of Social Work at Wilfrid Laurier University's Indigenous Field of Study program. She has been an accessibility specialist at Springtide Resources and has worked with organizations including Indigenous Climate Action and York University's Expanding the Circle project, which explored the intersection of indigeneity and disability in Ontario. Melanie is a member of the Alderville First Nation. John Lorinc is a freelance journalist, author, and urbanist who writes about cities, climate, technology, and many other topics for publications including the New York Times, the Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, Reader's Digest, The Walrus, Atlantic Cities, Maclean's, and Spacing, where he is a senior editor. John's books include The New City, How the Crisis of Canada's Cities is Reshaping Our Nation, and Dream States, Smart Cities, Technology, and the Pursuit of Urban Utopias. Lisa Prosper is a senior advisor on cultural landscape at ERA Architects and an independent cultural heritage consultant whose work centers on the identification, commemoration, and conservation of cultural landscapes and other forms of place-based heritage with First Nations communities, governments, the private sector, and heritage organizations, including UNESCO, ICOMOS, and the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. She currently chairs the Indigenous Cultural Heritage Advisory Council at Parks Canada. Lisa is a member of the Acadia First Nation and lives in Whitehorse, Yukon. Last but not least, Michael McClelland is an architect, author, and a founding principal at ERA Architects. Michael's work blends heritage conservation, cultural planning, and urban design, and has shaped heritage sites across Toronto and beyond, including the Distillery District, Evergreen Brickworks, the TD Centre, Mirvish Village, the Royal Ontario Museum, Union Station, and the Art Gallery of Ontario. Michael has edited and co-authored several books, including Concrete Toronto, a guidebook to concrete architecture from the 50s to the 70s, and The Ward Uncovered, the archaeology of everyday life. Welcome. So this forum is being recorded so that we can, yes, please. This forum is being recorded so that we can share it as widely as possible with the broader community, and you'll be able to find that on ERA's YouTube page after the fact. There'll be some time for questions from the audience here and online afterwards. For those on Zoom, please put your questions in the chat. So I've got a few questions just to get things going. My first question is whether each of you can just say a few words about what the term cultural heritage means to you, and we can go clockwise if that's helpful. To start with Melanie.
Sure. I think cultural health for me, as an Indigenous person that's blind or visually impaired, means connection. It also means when people are not able to connect to the various spaces, then that creates unhealthy spaces. So when I think of cultural health, I think of if I want to attend a museum and there isn't someone, for example, that can guide me around because I'm not able to touch things, then that means I'm not able to participate in a particular way. So it's thinking about how can we create inclusive spaces where all can participate in a meaningful way.
Michael, would you like to go next?
Sure. Cultural health is very interesting because I think even the discussion today, it's a new term. Planners at the city don't talk about cultural health. And I think for us, it's filling a void to actually you need to use new terminology to talk about new ideas. And cultural health is, I think, with the way we should be thinking about the city. In other words, how we place value and how we understand the value of culture for everyone. So it's kids in the suburbs, it's people downtown, it's different age. It's like Melanie, it's a perfect example of how to be thinking about the need for accessibility to culture. So it's access to culture. And we need to talk today about what cultural health in a broader way means. But I think the interesting thing is it's a new term.
So I had to write my notes, so apologies. But I would say for me, what comes to mind thinking about cultural health is not so much, I'm not sure I could define it at this point. And so rather I was sort of struck by what instinctively comes to mind about what might threaten cultural health. And so I think those things would include loss of language, loss of access to traditional lands and waters, for example, loss of knowledge, disconnection from community and traditions, and of course, trauma. So I think about an environment that reflects your values, spaces that enable the expression and practice of your culture, and power to determine those things are often taken for granted by the majority or dominant culture that is building these spaces. But really for communities that don't have that power, the built environment can often seem very foreign, and the space is valued by one community can in fact be harmful for others. And the spaces of lesser value for one community can be highly valued by others. And I just think heritage and design are both intimately involved in that sort of tangle.
So I did what journalists do, which is I did a Google search, and I found that when you Google cultural health, you get a lot of links to papers and websites to talk about cultural competencies in the healthcare field. And so I thought there's actually an interesting metaphor there because, in healthcare, cultural competency sort of denotes that interface between patients and the healthcare system, and it places an onus on the part of healthcare providers to kind of meet people where they're at, and recognize that language and wealth and status and all of these things have something to have a bearing on the way they will navigate the healthcare process. So if you apply that kind of thinking to city building, I mean, there's a pretty good analogy to the way the built form encounters the city as a constantly changing group of people. And I thought that's a kind of an interesting way of looking at it, because in public space, we're always encountering, these large solid objects we call buildings. And, to what extent are they receptive to the presence of people in public space? And we could all think of examples where it works really well and think of examples where it works really poorly. And, maybe we can talk about this, how to, go about building, placemaking and, creating public spaces that do the sort of things that healthcare providers do when they are aiming to sort of deliver healthcare in a culturally competent way.
Those are all so great. And I think the next question really picks up on all of them in different ways, which is, like we all know well here, approaches to design and conservation and city building don't come from nowhere. They're kind of part of a lineage of wisdom about how we think cities should be shaped, and specifically like what experiences are valuable to engender with the work. And so I wonder, it's a tough question, but what sort of things do you think we as practitioners and commentators and interested people should be valuing when we're creating those conventions? Anyone can start.
Should we try Melanie? Melanie, would you like to start?
Apparently. So ideally, I think spaces need to be created from the beginning in terms of having an inclusive lens. And so what that means is building more relationships with one another so that we're not having to recreate places where there's been problems before, right? And so that may mean for myself having a conversation with architects before they're before they're making the design, so that I can say, can we start to have conversations about creating spaces from an inclusive perspective, or from a design perspective, where anyone that comes to the universal design, so that anyone that comes to the space is welcomed. It doesn't matter what kind of human being label they have stuck on them, lack of a better word. It is inclusive, so that like it's a wider door frame, so that if someone is in a wheelchair, they can get through without making damage. Or it can be aisles that are a bit longer with some tactile, so that I know where I am using a cane, as opposed to these massive wide open spaces there. I'm kind of like, where am I ever going to get the door, right? So can we start to build relationships with designers, and asking communities, what do they need? Because what we may need in Toronto at this moment for inclusive spaces may be very different from what folks need up north. It's having that conversation to create those relationships so that we can really have more practical designs that are going to include everyone, rather than an afterthought. Because I do find in many of the accessibility pieces that I've done before, it's been practical solutions that can solve problems. It doesn't have to be complicated. As human beings, I think we make it more complicated than it needs to be.
I could pick up on that inclusivity piece, I think, a little bit, because I think when we think of culture, that can tend to be a highbrow kind of term. It's like culture, it's the opera. But in fact, culture is a much broader term, and we need to understand how to unlock the very specific cultures that exist in the city. And I think I think Toronto is the best in the world for understanding issues of diversity. And I think we need to really play into that and really need to understand the diversity in the city and bring it forward. And I think that's something that the city doesn't do well at the present time. It certainly doesn't do well within its structure. It's trying its best at City Hall, but it really, in terms of how buildings get built, its diversity isn't there yet. And I think it's a really crucial problem. And so when I think of inclusivity, I tend to think of kids growing up in the suburbs and just how much access do they have, and how an issue of value is the street that you grow up in the suburbs. Does that street have value? Do we understand the street itself has cultural value? That the suburbs people growing up in the suburbs have to connect to the fact that it has an indigenous heritage, that it has that we have value for things that happened recently, like in the 70s. Your subdivision get built in the 70s. That's of interest. What's your street name? Where did it come from? And I think that's that idea about inclusivity is also connected to Alessandro, which you said originally, being grounded. I think cultural health has a strong connection to being grounded and being accessible.
I guess I would pick up on the idea of relationships, and I think that you hear that a lot with respect to sort of seeking to include Indigenous perspectives into projects and to creating a better understanding of Indigenous people's relationships to existing places, especially in urban centers where it may not be as obvious, at least in a contemporary context. Certainly, there's movement towards understanding a more fulsome history of Indigenous peoples in urban centers. But and so the question of relationship for me is this idea that, you know, currently in design processes, there's always identification of stakeholder groups, people who clearly have an interest in whatever project's underway and whatever space is being dealt with. And unfortunately, oftentimes Indigenous peoples are understood as stakeholders, and it doesn't really allow for the kinds of relationships I think that you need to develop to really understand how you might address that community's needs or interests or values that I would argue could potentially contribute to their cultural health and therefore cultural health of the city writ large. So I don't know the answer to that question, but I think somehow moving beyond stakeholder kind of relationships to something more collaborative, something more partnership-based, something deeper. And, you know, the point made earlier about doing it sooner and all of that, we've all heard that before, but I think also it's a different ambition. I think we have a different,
So Lisa, can I jump in? Because I think the way the city's planned, I think people don't really understand how the city is planned. But the province has released something called the Provincial Planning Statement. It's a statement, it's not a policy, it's a statement. And you can search through that. There's nothing about cultural heritage, cultural value. There's nothing about cultural health. Cultural health, those terms don't exist in it. It's all about building more housing faster, and it's a rather stupid document. And when it does talk about cultural, if you look up cultural, it's mostly do the search. It's mostly agricultural that it's talking about. But when it does talk about culture, it's cultural heritage, and then it goes right to the Heritage Act, and then you have to be designated, and you have to be a property that's designated. So there's nothing, and when it talks about indigenous stuff, it says you should, it's kind of the indigenous requirement to consult,
Mhm.
but it doesn't say you do anything with it. So there's no action there that connects cultural health, culture, indigenous issues. None of that stuff gets fed into the planning statement, which then feeds our official plan. And all of those things are how things get developed. And there's really no priority or no emphasis put on culture, value, heritage in a very extremely limited way. It's only buildings. And so it's we have to insert these new ideas that cultural health by stealth somehow. We have to get them in there. Sorry, John, I was going
to come to you just in a second. Can I just follow up on this for a second? Because I was going to ask you, Michael, as a heritage architect, can you say a bit more about how the Heritage Act relates to cultural health? Because you're talking about planning. And I wonder specific, if it refers to the Heritage Act, I wonder how you see the Heritage Act as relating to cultural health right now.
Okay, well, the planning statement shovels all the direction towards the Heritage Act. The Heritage Act is really, I got to say, almost a dinosaur at this point, because I think culturally, as a community, we tend to think that there's a broad range of things that have heritage value. There's all kinds, there's intangible heritage, there's indigenous heritage, there's recent immigrant heritage, there's modern building heritage, there's all kinds of things. But the Heritage Act only says you must designate the property, and then that's the only thing that's heritage. And that's in other jurisdictions that in current, when we talk about heritage, it's called authoritative heritage. So it means only the upper class, the ruling class, get to decide what's of value. And so other people like Black Lives Matter, for example, need to really push that envelope very tough to, and that's why we need to think about heritage in a broader way. So we're talking about cultural health. It's actually heritage is a key component to how you ground yourself in your community. But the heritage is basically could be anything and everything. And it could provide many contexts for understanding your community much more broadly. The Heritage Act doesn't do that at all, and that feeds into the Planning Act, and that's why we have really problematic decisions made in planning where you can't protect a music hall, you can't protect artist studios, you can't identify and think about what's strong about queer culture in Toronto because it's not a building. So I'm going on. Sorry.
Oh, it's good. For my fourth question, I wanted to shift to public space. It'd be great to start with you, John, which is, that's a more conventional link to health as we're used to thinking about it, which is like fresh air and greenery and stuff, and there's conversations normally about how much public space is there, where is it, who can access it, are there benches? How do you think Toronto's doing, and what should we be valuing most in our approach to public space?
We do a terrible job with public space. The city doesn't value it, underfunds its maintenance, and basically negotiates away public space provisions and new developments, which I think is a situation that exists historically. It goes right back to the way the city was founded and its political culture in the late 19th century, and to kind of undo that, I think that we could learn a lot from other places, and for me it's very curious that Torontonians come from all over. Like there so many people in the city who come from other places that do things in public space differently, and for some reason there's a sort of a blood-brain barrier, and those lessons and those kind of approaches to public space don't kind of filter through. And one point I'd make about this is at the level of principle is that if you want to say, okay, well, what is a what does health in public space mean? I would say that one element of that would be flexibility, and that public spaces and buildings should be able to do lots of different things. They shouldn't be kind of they shouldn't be overdetermined. And I think that we tend to overdetermine a lot of elements in our built form. It kind of makes me think of there were two types of toys that you can get, like when my kids were little. One was like these beautiful, elaborate, sort of plastic molded things that had, and there was a lot of eye candy value when you, took took it out of the package, but you couldn't do anything with them because they were absolutely rigid. And the other things are like Lego and, stuff that you could build. And those were the favorite ones because they have they can sort of adapt to the people who are in that space at the time, which I think is really important.
Can you think of any good examples of that type of public space?
Yeah, I think that I recently was in Bryant Park in New York, and it's it's sort of a bucket list example, but I've seen similar examples in Mexico City, for example, which has fantastic public spaces, and they just do all sorts of things, right? And there's nobody who's coming in and saying, okay, you can't do that, and the furniture isn't all bolted down, and there are multiple uses that are available to people in those communities, and that's good. That's the way it should be.
Absolutely. My fifth question was about accessibility. Melanie, as someone who's doing really interesting work on how we define accessibility, I wonder if you could just talk a bit about the standardized approaches to accessibility in city building as you see them, and how they could be different, maybe.
I'm making a face because I'm kind of like, I really do feel that our perspective needs to shift. I think there's some spaces that are okay. Like I think of Union. I used to be able to, back in the day when I had a guide dog, get from the front door to the GO train, no problem. But, well, not because now I don't have a guide dog, but it's changed so much that it's so open that it's like, I wish I had an app to get through that station because it's very difficult. So again, I guess I come back to the awareness piece. And I wish that we could, again, I feel like I'm kind of repeating myself, but start with the conversation at the beginning and building the relationships. And to Lisa's point, not just building the relationships of what people need, but also that there be tangible actions to those agreed upon things that need to happen. So if there's a museum, or if there's a park that's inclusive for all, and you're coming from that perspective, then again, no matter who comes to that space, they can use that space. It's not about who has the privilege to go to a particular space and access it and who doesn't. Because cultural health is very important for well-being, mentally, emotionally, physically, and spiritually, right? And so it really is about how can anyone come to the space and participate in it in a meaningful way from the get-go, rather than, again, trying to fix pieces along the way. So another really good example is in the distillery district we were speaking, there's really nice sidewalks, but they're very hard to navigate with the cane, right? So again, it's can we start to have conversations at the get-go with our perspective changing from a all are welcomed perspective versus we have these policies that were made from a colonial perspective, like in 1960s, and they're not really serving us at this moment.
Anyone else?
I
have thoughts?
gotta say, we worked on the distillery district, so we're responsible for the cobblestones. So, no, Living like, we were talking about it earlier, and I totally agree. We all, as architects, we tend not to, we think a ramp will do it. And that's a really unfortunate way to look at things, and we're trying very hard to understand that more clearly. But now I understand, like, maybe as many as 25% of the population of Canadians think that they have some form of disability, or say they have some form of disability. It's higher than that, yeah.
It's higher than that.
Okay, well,
Because when you think of someone that may have a mobility disability and uses a walker, but they also may have a learning disability, and so the various environment may be so overwhelmingly stimulated that it's hard to access it.
yeah, and also I find I wrecked my foot recently, and I realized I need places to sit down often, and so just understanding those kinds of issues and how Canadians function, and the more sensitive we can be to it, the better. But we really need to talk, and unfortunately, we have professionals in the field who sort of say everything must be fully accessible. And we don't even know what fully accessible and be completely, we don't know what that term means. And so we need to get away from these this weird terminology and actually start to talk to the people using buildings and understand it better. Yeah.
Lisa, I wanted to pick up on something really interesting that you said earlier, which is that spaces designed in a way that could be culturally healthy or have benefits for one group might be detrimental to another group. So it's sort of a zero-sum game in that way in particular instances. And I think this is my sixth question, and it's sort of getting at the idea that sometimes we form cultural connections with places that aren't related to how they're designed, or they're kind of in spite of how they're designed. And I'm thinking about Kensington Market, right? What makes Kensington Market amazing is not that it's these bay and gable narrow streets, it's because of the organic thing that arose there. Can you talk a bit about that, and whether you think it's a difficult question, but whether there's a way that it could not be a zero-sum game in that way, that you could kind of design for both?
Yeah, I can't answer that last part, but I will pick up on some of the ideas you said. So I think that certainly really effectively the appropriation of space for unintended users or unintended purposes is part of the charm of urban spaces, right? It sort of happens, I think, all the time. But I guess this other idea about, you know, what constitutes heritage, and then the tool applied to then deal with that heritage is designation. So it's a very restrictive way of defining heritage, and then it's a singular tool to actually try and do something with that. And so what that means is it doesn't allow for expressions of value that don't fall into those boxes to sort of find legitimate, or they're not championed, or they're not sort of sufficiently valued by others who may be the people in charge of designing those spaces, because there's no obligations, or they're not understood, or they're not even the idea of even trying to understand them if they don't know that they're there, and so on. So one of the other consequences of the sort of the built heritage approach is it also assumes that that heritage is unproblematic and or positive, reflective of great things, great men who did great things, and this is their house, and that kind of stuff. And a lot of that can be highly problematic from an Indigenous perspective. As we understand now, you know, the renaming of places is a result of, you know, sort of shining a light on those people who we've sort of held up previously are no longer sort of warranting that. And so, but if you go in a conventional heritage kind of notion, you've got your SOS, you've got all these features about that building, about that guy's house and all that stuff. And it just, and if that's your starting point, then you're sort of, you're perpetuating a colonial perspective through contemporary acts, because you respond, then you're obliged to honor that heritage, etc. And that's a recolonizing act. Like, so there needs to be not just recognition of how that's problematic. There needs to be some sort of undoing of that. I've probably gone totally
No.
beyond the bounds of your question, but
Not at all.
that's what sort of triggered. Yeah.
That's great. John, another situation where perhaps the way we value an area of the city is different than its design value, at least by sort of like the conventional wisdom, would be the suburbs. We've spoken about the suburbs before, you've written about them. I think they're a really interesting area of the city, both because they're the majority of the city in terms of landmass and population size, but also because they're kind of poised to transform as Toronto continues to grow and, you know, zoning opens up. How do you see our, I don't know, cultural relationship changing to the suburbs, and how does cultural health maybe play into that?
Well, this is a very complicated question because socially the suburbs, like we're talking about the post-war suburbs mostly, are incredibly dynamic places, right? I mean, they're, you know, people from all over the place, and you know, a lot of you know, they're very fluid social environments, but not especially flexible, right? Because they're, you know, they contain features like reverse lot arterials, which are extremely difficult to sort of retrofit, plus the fact that there's a lot of space. So a lot of capital can land in one spot and produce, produce the type of built form, which I don't think has the kind of, I think it's overdetermined, and it's, it can be, you know, very massive relative to what's around it. So those are all kind of challenges. And I think that the, you know, some of the ways of thinking about places like Kensington, you know, can be brought to bear in the suburbs. And, you know, some of the learning I think is about not planning and not over determining things, right? So, you know, I mean, one of the things about Kensington is that Kensington has sort of defied all the, you know, attempts to sort of put it in the box. And so it's constantly changing. And there are, you know, there are places in the suburbs that, you know, have all of that potential, right? You know, strip malls, I've written about strip malls, are really interesting spaces, and, you know, they provide all sorts of social benefits, and, you know, and there are interesting ideas about, you know, making them more pedestrian friendly, and, you know, just kind of making them more urban and less car focused. So, you know, so all of which say that there requires a sort of a deftness of approach to public space, and, you know, in the sort of post-war suburbs that I think can be easily overlooked by just the sheer scale of the redevelopment that is permitted on very large footprint sites like former shopping malls and former factory sites.
Totally.
I want to jump in about Kensington Market, because it got mentioned a couple of times. And right now the city is trying to put it in a box because they're proposing to designate it as a heritage district under the Heritage Act. And that means you can designate all the buildings. But there's nothing in the Heritage Act that allows you to make sure that the cheese shop stays there, or that the cheese shop still tells cheese at a great price, and it's this fantastic variety of cheese. So that's the Heritage District approach is a solid gentrification of Kensington Market in a horrible way. So I'm thoroughly opposed to the designation of Kensington Market. There is the city is now going to produce a culture plan, and it's going to come out this fall. It's the first time City of Toronto's had a culture plan produced by Economic Development and Culture in 20 years. And we've got big hopes that might help address this issue about not using a heavy hammer of designation and working with the planners to control neighborhoods, but actually think about things that might make the neighborhoods more vibrant and interesting. I don't know what's going to be in the culture plan, but I'm looking forward to it. And I think a little bit like the broader sense of how things can be interpreted. UNESCO, for example, has designated the tango for Argentina as a kind of, that's the idea about an intangible cultural heritage. And I think Toronto needs to figure out what its tango might be, right? It needs to actually really think that through, because we need to think about these things that are these cultural references that play around in the wind a little bit, that aren't really pinned down, put in a box. And I think that's where we've got potentially tremendous strength, because John, as you mentioned, there's all these community groups who come from absolutely everywhere, and they've got such a rich knowledge and a rich kind of cultural life that we need to unleash for it to be effective in the city of Toronto.
My last question, seventh question, I think sort of ties everything together, which is about loss. Because I think when you're city building, it's always a loss because there's always something that was there before. And then there's kind of a birth because it's a new thing. And those things are hopefully conscientiously related and connected. But loss is something that heritage conservation practitioners think about a lot, and especially how to mitigate it in the context of heritage. And that could be a building that's no longer there, or it could be a space that's become associated with a loss. How do you think the ways that we approach loss in spaces in built environments maybe fosters cultural health or hinders it? And there was a picture of St. Anne's Church up there just now, and that's a loss in the built environment that I think of often and kind of don't know how to deal with, I would say, and don't know what will come of it. You can take that anywhere you want to go. I don't know, Melanie, if you have any thoughts.
Oh, boy. I think as an Indigenous person, I think the loss has to be named. I think sometimes, and even as a counselor, I know people don't really want to look at loss and name the grief that's there and name the trauma that's there. And I think it's really important to name it. And then you can move on, like you were saying, moving forward for sure. I think it's that whatever we end up doing, that if we're not honoring what's been done in the past to move forward and do things in a better way, then we're going to just keep recreating what we've done in the past. So I think that's also about the loss. So it's like we don't always want to name the things we've done incorrectly. And so can we name what's been wronged, create relationships where we can move forward, and also identify the loss that's happened, so that it just helps to foster healthier relationships moving forward.
It's interesting you say it's related to heritage. I actually try not to think about loss too much. I think that city building has to be essentially a positive, optimistic undertaking. You have to be, it's almost like being improv comic, it's yes and people who are, there's a lot of negativity, I got to say, in the heritage world about this is going wrong and that's bad, and I don't like change and all those sort of things. Those actually don't help anything really. And I think where cultural health can be good is if you're actually thinking in a very positive outlook to understand things better. What fascinates me at the moment, I've got to say, is Indigenous, the engagement with Indigenous communities that didn't happen 10, 15, 20 years ago. And the things that we're learning are immense, because I actually think and it's really interesting. We balance kind of, are we appropriating Indigenous knowledge, which is inappropriate, or are we learning from Indigenous knowledge? And I'd like to be not appropriating, but I want to try to understand that respectful boundary. But I think there's tremendous things that Canadian culture can. There was a book, My Fair Country. I forgot who wrote that. Mon Pays Métis, and it's about the fact that the French culture, the English culture, and the Indigenous culture build a unique environment that's very respectful of others and invites others to be part of Canada. So I think I'm going on a little bit, but I think rather than think about loss, I'd think about growth and health.
I just want to say, I agree. I just think that in order to get growth and health, sometimes you have to name the losses. in my
Okay,
opinion.
that's,
Just give them the 2 seconds.
no,
Sorry, Lisa.
No, it's okay.
thanks, Melanie.
I guess I would say on the notion of loss that, and again, to be a little bit more optimistic is, I see all of that as sort of I call it a heritage of opportunity. So, you may have lost a physical structure, but, and I really hate to bang this drum all the time, but just to say that all urban fabric is on traditional lands. So the loss is the traditional lands. So anything that, you know, the built realm is already a mechanism of loss, an instrument of loss for Indigenous peoples. Then what that means is the sort of the realm of redevelopment and those sort of activities are opportunities to name the loss or to honor or recognize the loss, but then also an opportunity to understand better, or to have it a place where Indigenous peoples can find expression of their culture in those places. Not all places are good. That's going to be appropriate, and that it's not going to be sort of evenly spread across. But I think simply the notion that that kind of investigation starts to percolate into the field, I think is interesting, and I think ultimately valuable for the.
So I think that I always like to think of cities in 4 dimensions, with time being the 4th dimension. And, you know, one of the sort of the pleasures is not the right word, but you know, the enervating aspect of being in a city is being in a city that has existed through time and has evolved through time. And that isn't constantly sort of erasing everything and starting from scratch. And, you know, but turning that, you know, aspiration into like regulation and policy is incredibly difficult. And doesn't mean that we shouldn't try, but there clearly, you know, there are clearly limits on either side, right? You know, too much erasure is problematic, too much protection is problematic. So there is this need to find a balance. And then just picking up on, you know, what all of you have said, the sort of whole kind of, you know, the flip side of losses, you know, hope and thinking about the future. And so I'll just sort of, you know, mention a really interesting project in that respect, which is the reconstruction of the Lower Don lands. And so what was lost was a port area that was never especially viable financially. You know, goes back to 1912. And it struggled for, you know, better part of a century, and just basically became a place where you would pile like salt and industrial materials. So that project is a way of reclaiming something that was there before in a different way, which was this wetland, and, you know, gives rise to something new, which are new communities and new recreational opportunities that hopefully will sort of be able to sort of synthesize what was there before in the two stages of its evolution, right? The industrial and the pre-industrial, and then looking forward to something new. That's a really good example, I think, of city building that kind of gets all of those elements together.
Great. We have some time for some questions from both audiences, digital and in the flesh. Do we have a microphone for those in the room? If you want to ask a question, come up to the front and use the mic. Thank you. Give you a grace period before I start yelling at you. Well, while you sort of ruminate, there's one from our online audience, which is, I think most of us agree that the idea of inclusivity or accessibility, I think they mean agree with, but how does the concept of cultural health apply to specific neighborhoods like Little Jamaica or Spadina Chinatown? I think they're just wanting kind of commentary on how it plays out in these very specific areas of the city that are unique.
I can comment on that a little bit. I think Little Jamaica is a very interesting test case where there was a consideration, should it be a heritage conservation district, which again would be just the freezing of the particular buildings without actually addressing the uses in those buildings. Economic development jumped in and sort of said maybe economic development should be involved. And I think there's a really interesting balance play that's happening at the City of Toronto in terms of its planning department responsible for everything, or is economic development, culture and tourism play a role that's strong. And so they've stepped in and sort of said, well, how do we protect the culture, the cultural and economic health of these businesses, which leads to an idea about discussion about legacy businesses. Are there businesses that need to be supported by the municipality? I'm not sure that's gone many different directions. Little Jamaica. What was the other neighborhood? Sorry.
Chinatown, Spadina Chinatown.
Yeah, well, there's a study about Chinatown right now, and again in the same kind of vein. Is it something that needs to be conserved as it sits, or does it need to be looked at as what are the economic drivers for Chinatown? And I think that's still in process, but I think that's a different way to look at how different parts of the city function. And I think again, I think that's where cultural health, the terminology of cultural health, could play a very strong role. What's the cultural health of Little Jamaica? What's the cultural health of Chinatown?
I guess I would just pick up on that a little bit, and I'm not sure if I'm right in this, but it's sort of that heritage district approach is sort of a little bit like a facadism approach in that you're preserving what it looks like, but not necessarily how it functions, right? Or how that space and the value in the space is generated. And it seems to me that that's the alchemy, right? It's how that created those spaces. And one of the things that I'm slightly anticipating and slightly worried about is that the indigenization, let's say, of a lot of the projects that are going on now is in part about an interest and an ambition to have Indigenous peoples represented in our urban fabric. Absolutely. I'm all for that. But without a sense of supporting that with substantive change or meaningful opportunities for fulsome expression by communities who might use that space, accessibility to those spaces that, that those communities might use. I think there's a risk of facadism, an Indigenous facadism, or I don't know what you call it, but some sort of notion where there's markers, but there's nothing actually supporting you know, whereas these communities,
Mhm.
there's that real, you know, that's why those communities exist. It's because of the people and what they do there, not what the buildings look like.
Totally.
I'll just say that I would argue that that some caution should be exercised about cementing businesses in place. And the, you know, like all of the places that you've mentioned are like entrepreneurially very dynamic, right? You know, businesses come, businesses go. And you know, I think that's basically how it should be, right? That's the way our commerce works. And, you know, so we talk about Chinatown, you say, well, which Chinatown, right? Because there's several in the Greater Toronto area. They all have their own distinctive features and you know, interplay with the immediate local community. So the use of public policy to sort of kind of freeze something commercial in time, I think has risks. And, you know, so if I'm a business owner on Eglinton West, or, you know, I might not be so happy with that perspective. But, you know, from the point of view of the way, you know, urban markets work, you know, I think that you have to sort of think about the, you know, that the dynamism is really an important feature of that.
It's a great counterpoint. I like that. Melanie, let's give the last word to you. Any last thoughts?
I guess I think that when we're thinking about universal design, let's think about who is in these spaces and who isn't, and why aren't they? And if and because we're wanting to do more with Indigenous peoples, ensure that those relationships are being done in a meaningful and an intentional and a good way. And not saying that they have or haven't been, I'm just saying that they need to be.
Thank you. That concludes the panel. If you want to revisit this conversation, it'll be available, as I say, on ERA's YouTube channel, and you can check out other content about heritage, urbanism, design, and culture at our website, which is www.eraarch.ca. It's really important to have these conversations, and especially in public. So thanks to all of you. Thank you.